All right, our numbers are continuing to tick up, but I think in the interest of time, we'll get going here. So thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. Acadia Center and Clean Air Task Force are super pleased to have the chance to present our newly released report. The energy is about to shift, pathways to a community-centered, resilient, and decarbonized grid for New England. This is first of a two-part webinar series on our report. We decided it was going to be too much ground to cover in just one sitting. So we're covering part one today, and stay tuned to the end of the webinar for details on the second part of the webinar series in January. My name is Jamie Dickerson. I'm Senior Director here at Acadia Center. If you don't know us, Acadia Center is a climate and clean energy nonprofit based in Maine and working across the Northeast US on research, advocacy, and implementation efforts. Our mission is to advance bold, effective clean energy solutions for a livable climate and a stronger, more equitable economy. And we have been super happy to partner on this project with our friends and colleagues at Clean Air Task Force. CATF is a global nonprofit organization working to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change by catalyzing the rapid development and deployment of low carbon energy and other climate technologies. CATF has offices in Boston, DC, and Brussels, with staff working around the world. So let's go to our next slide, please. I'll do a quick run of show intros. On the right, you see some of my partners in crime today. First, my Acadia Center colleague, Ben Butterworth, who directs our climate, energy, and equity analysis work. His research and analysis really was key and pivotal to making this report possible. So I'm eager to have you all hear from him. And we're also going to be joined by Nelson Falkenberg and Nicole Pavia at Clean Air Task Force, who I'd really like to shout out for being such stellar partners in this endeavor. It's been a pleasure to work with your team. Nelson is a senior associate on, and Nicole is the interim director of CATF's Clean Energy Infrastructure team. I'm sure most of you all know the drill by now for webinars like this. Attendees will be muted, but we really encourage you to drop your questions and musings in the Q&A feature in Zoom throughout the webinar. And a copy of the slides and a recording will be shared around to attendees afterwards too. So fear not on that front. On the left side of the slide, you see the run of show we have planned. I'm going to provide some framing on the report and offer some background on New England, but I'll be turning things over quickly to Ben to walk through the 5 decarbonization pathway studies that we examined for the report. Nelson and Nicole there will take the baton to round out the key takeaways from the analysis and really start to discuss what our findings mean for the region's evolving grid portfolio and, as a result, what it means for siting, permitting, and community engagement. The bulk of the second webinar that we have planned will zoom in on those lessons learned for siting, permitting, and community engagement, and we'll examine several notable case studies of real projects across the region. We will endeavor to save plenty of time at the end for Q&A, so do stay around for that. And as I said, get your questions added into the Q&A function. So let's go to the next slide and dive right in. At the core of this report, if you haven't read it yet, is the importance of siting, permitting, and community engagement for clean energy infrastructure projects across New England. When we set out to undertake the work around a year ago, we were seeing what you all were probably seeing, which is very big clean energy ambitions, but many contentious project siting debates on the ground and community engagement efforts that were unfortunately sometimes inadequate, late, or absent altogether. We knew there were several high-quality studies out there on decarbonization pathways for the region, but no comparative analysis or no sort of clear solution set for the infrastructure needed, which obviously is critical to help us answer the question of how much stuff are we likely going to need to build over the coming 2 to 3 decades. Additionally, we recognize the need for addressing community concerns and better equipping communities to participate meaningfully in siting and permitting processes, to have their voice heard, and to attain real benefits from projects. This includes, obviously, communities of all shapes, sizes, and types across the region. There are 1,300 plus communities in New England, municipalities, localities. But it also includes sort of lowercase c communities, including environmental justice communities who have borne disproportionate burdens of hosting energy infrastructure historically. So we set out to undertake an in-depth analysis, both quantitative and qualitative, to try and paint a better picture of what it's going to take for New England to realize its energy transition and achieve the state climate mandates that are in place by mid-century, 2050. And I don't know about you, but I certainly feel that 2050 both feels a lifetime away and also right around the corner. So there is a matter of urgency here. We wanted to look both at the physical infrastructure transition between now and then, but also the social side, since we know it will take much greater buy-in, acceptance, and trust from the communities that will host clean energy resources, as you can see from the quote on the right side of this slide. As we say in the report, the region's communities and its people are very much at the center of this transition, as much as the grid and physical infrastructure is itself. Now, I did want to note our report does come on the heels of new legislation passed in Massachusetts, which enacts major new reforms to the process of siting and permitting in the Commonwealth. Those reforms are, I think, very much within the spirit of our findings here and vice versa. The centralized approval approach, state-level siting board, a new public trust fund to pay community interveners to participate in the siting board processes, and giving certainty to approval timelines for projects. So we hope the report and the discussion today will help give you some helpful context for the work ahead in Massachusetts and some of the work left to be done around the rest of the region as well. I do want to point out we opted for a title for this report that tries to capture sort of the conditional inflection point that the region stands at right now. We have such promising change within reach, but such important and really big work ahead to unlock that shift when it comes to siting and permitting. The energy is about to shift, as you may know, is a phrase that's been coined by Jaylen Brown of the Boston Celtics, who is also the reigning NBA Finals MVP. He famously tweeted that out in the midst of a historic midseason slump several years ago, but I think had the faith and the foresight to know that the glory of an NBA championship was within reach. So we're taking inspiration from that, and we know that the region's energy systems must rapidly shift from fossil to clean, but also the region's policies and processes for siting, permitting, and community engagement have to be improved and strengthened to unlock a clean energy transition with real community involvement and benefit. So come along as we unpack what that means in more concrete terms for New England. And as I said, it's 1,300 plus communities. So let's go to the next slide, please. My final word before I pass things off to Ben is a quick gloss on the background and history of New England's regional electricity grid, especially for the benefit of anyone tuning in from outside the region. New England's grid, it's a restructured wholesale market. It's operated by the Independent System Operator of New England, ISO New England. And the region has made notable progress, reducing its reliance on coal and oil in the last 2 to 3 decades, but it does remain heavily dependent on natural gas for generation. Last year, gas was 55% of generation in the region. And the region is at the literal and figurative end of the interstate gas pipeline network. So we rely on imports from out of the region, primarily by pipeline, but also via shipments of LNG to really meet many of our peak demand periods. If it's helpful to paint the picture, the region has 2 nuclear plants in the region. We get about 13% of net energy for load via imports from neighboring regions, New York, Quebec, and New Brunswick. And the region has made notable investments in energy efficiency and distributed solar that are really substantially shaping both daily and annual demand patterns. And we do have new major offshore wind resources just starting to come online. The region has a summer peaking system, although that may change. But in the winter, gas heating customers take priority delivery of gas over power generators, and the resulting supply constraints have driven high energy prices and spikes in both costs and emissions as dirtier fuels have been called on to make up the difference. So those challenges have been, as you can imagine, acute during polar vortexes and winter cold snaps, which I think really shine a spotlight on the resilience and extreme weather vulnerabilities that the region has to increasingly plan for. So I'll summarize by saying the evolution, the shift is already underway. The region's largest fossil unit, Mystic Generating Station, did retire safely in May of this year. And the region's final lone coal plant in New Hampshire has also announced plans for its retirement in 2028 and repowering with battery storage and solar. So again, we're seeing that progress starting to move. So that's all from me for now. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll hand things off to my colleague, Ben Butterworth, who will take us through some excellent research findings on what the future may hold for this region. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Jamie. So as Jamie mentioned, the project team performed a literature review on 5 economy-wide deep decarbonization studies with a time horizon out to 2050 to develop a better understanding of the level of power of sector generation and transmission build-out modeled to be needed to achieve high levels of electrification and deep decarbonization across sectors of the economy. Deep decarbonization is defined differently across the studies. Gross economy-wide emissions reductions in New England in the 5 studies range from 80% to 90% below 1990 levels of emissions by 2050. I won't read through the name of each of the 5 studies, but you can see them listed out on the slide. 4 of the studies are New England specific. Princeton Net Zero America is the one exception. It's a national study, but provided modeling results at a state-specific level as well. It's important to note that each of these studies examined multiple pathways. Our literature review focused on one pathway in each study that was electrification focused. In other words, pathways where electrification of building and transportation is the dominant end-use decarbonization strategy. The following slides summarize some of the key quantitative takeaways from the literature review. But before we jump to that, it's important to note that decarbonization pathway studies are not forecasts. Generally speaking, pathway studies are designed to enable policymakers to make comparisons across pathways to understand the trade-offs, feasibility, risks, and commonalities across scenarios. So with that overview out of the way, let's jump into some of the results from the lit review. Next slide, please. Great. So I think it's helpful to start with demand. Across the scenarios of focus in all 5 studies, transitioning end uses, including building heating and transportation, from fossil fuel to electric, drove significant increases in both overall annual end-use electric loads and electric system peak demand by 2050. The graph on this slide focuses on annual demand and shows overall New England electric loads increasing 106% by 2050, from 117 terawatt hours to 241 terawatt hours. The average increase in end-use demand in New England across the 5 studies is highlighted by the orange and blue horizontal lines on the graph. Each of the 5 green columns represents one of the studies included in our lit review. The height of each column represents New England's annual electric demand in terms of terawatt hours. Although there was some variation in the modeled levels of annual demand in 2050 across the studies, all studies found an increase in demand by 2050 somewhere between 95% and 124%. On average across the studies, transportation was responsible for 51% of this annual load growth, and buildings were responsible for 39% of the load growth. Next slide. There's also significant growth in electric system peak demand by 2050, as demonstrated by the graph on this slide. The 5-study average shows New England 2050 peak demand doubling by 2050, from 27 gigawatts to 55 gigawatts, as indicated by the dashed orange and blue horizontal lines. This dramatic increase in peak demand in the region is primarily driven by electrification of space heating equipment and the high reliance on heat pumps during the coldest hours of the year. While New England currently experiences electric system peak demand in the summer, as Jamie mentioned, several of the studies modeled the switch over to winter peaking systems sometime in the 2030s, depending on the scale and speed of heat pump deployment, among other factors. Each of the orange columns represents total winter peak electric demand in New England in 2050 for one of the studies. We also included a 6th study, the ISO New England Transmission Study, which found comparable results. Demand response and load shifting, represented by the red striped areas at the top of the columns, were modeled to have some ability to reduce peak demand in the future. The 3 studies that shared modeling results for demand response and load shifting found they accounted for a 7% reduction in peak demand by 2050. Next slide, please. So shifting over to electric generation capacity, what are the implications of rising demand on generation capacity in New England by 2050? The graph on this slide answers this question, again using the 5 studies and scenarios of interest from the literature review. There's a lot going on in this graph, so quick orientation. The stacked column on the far left shows 2020 capacity in New England by resource type. The second column in from the left shows 2050 capacity using the 5-study average. The remaining 5 columns show the individual results from each of the 5 studies. If we focus strictly on the two columns on the far left now, we see that based on the 5-study average, capacity in New England is modeled to more than triple by 2050. That's an increase in capacity from 43 gigawatts to 145 gigawatts by 2050. Including expanded interregional transmission between New England and Canada brings this figure to 152 gigawatts by 2050. The tripling of total capacity is driven by a dramatic increase in wind and solar deployment. The 5-study average shows an 11x increase in combined wind and solar capacity by 2050, as indicated by the yellow and lighter blue segments on the columns. By 2050, solar and wind are modeled to account for 73% of total generation capacity in New England. Looking across the 5 studies, you can see there are some considerable differences. For example, the increase in total generation capacity by 2050 ranges from a low of 2.8x to a high of 3.8x. There is also some differences in the resource mix modeled by 2050. For example, studies modeling lower fuel combustion capacity in 2050, that's the dark blue segment at the bottom of each column, tend to see higher levels of solar and wind deployment. One note here, we use the term fuel combustion capacity as a catch-all for any plant that burns some fuel to generate power. The exact assumptions on which fuel is burned varies across studies, but generally this is some mix of natural gas and alternative fuels, including hydrogen or biofuels. Next slide. So however, model levels of installed capacity by resource in 2050, as shown in the previous slide, they don't tell the full story. The graph on this slide follows a similar layout to the graph on the previous slide, but this one is showing annual generation by resource measured in terawatt hours opposed to capacity. So focusing on the two furthest left columns again, we see that the 2050 5-study average indicates a 2.9x increase in annual electricity generation in New England by 2050. Net imports into the region, indicated by the red striped area at the top of each column, is also modeled to increase about 1.7x by 2050, based on the 5-study average. We learned on the previous slide that wind and solar combined made up 73% of installed capacity in 2050, but this slide indicates wind and solar play even a larger role in terms of annual generation, making up 84% of New England's generation by 2050. Similar to the capacity graph on the previous slide, there's significant variation across the studies in terms of resource generation mix by 2050, but I think the key takeaway here is the backbone role played by offshore wind and solar across studies. So with that, I'll hand it over to Nelson to present the following slides. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ben. So, hi everyone. I'm going to kick it off with our key takeaway number 5. The graph on this slide does a really good job of tying together the previous 2 slides that Ben presented. The sixth generation resources are listed across the x-axis on the slide, and the blue columns indicate the percent of total capacity made up by that resource in 2050. The orange bars next to the blue columns represent the percent of total generation from that resource. And at the bottom of the graph, you will see the capacity factor for each resource highlighted in light blue. This graph only displays the 5-study average, so does not display the individual results of the studies. A few interesting takeaways that can be gleaned from this graph. First, it highlights the importance of a diverse portfolio of generation resources to meet a dramatic increase in demand by 2050. Second, it highlights the key role, again, of offshore wind. Although offshore wind only accounts for 28% of installed capacity by 2050, across the 5-study average, it accounts for nearly half of annual generation in New England by 2050. Third, all the studies modeled continued baseline generation from nuclear energy in the region, which also has the highest capacity factor despite its low total capacity. And then the final interesting takeaway from this graph is that fuel combustion capacity increases about 20% by 2050 based on the 5-study average, but simultaneously, the annual generation from combustion resources in terms of terawatt hours actually decreases 75% between 2023 and 2050. This explains the extremely low capacity factor of 6% for fuel combustion. And we'll get into this topic a little more on the next slide. So next slide, please. Great. So this leads really well into our next topic on the top firm combustion capacity in 2050 across the studies. 4 studies provided granular data on this topic, and you can see them here on the slide. The height of the blue column indicates the gigawatts of combustion generation capacity online in New England in 2050, and the dashed horizontal orange lines represent the capacity factor for those combustion resources. And that capacity factor is also on the y-axis on the right. As demonstrated in the graph, the 4 studies all show some level of fuel combustion capacity staying online in 2050, however, with extremely low capacity factors ranging from about 4% to 8.3%. This highlights the limited and yet important role of firm generation resources, particularly during the coldest days of winter with low wind conditions. The Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2050, which is the furthest left bar, envisions significantly less combustion capacity compared to the other studies, but the highest capacity factor for those resources. It's also important to note that these pathway studies use fuel combustion capacity, whether it be gas or alternative fuels, to fill the role of firm resources to complement variable renewable generation, particularly during winter peaking events in 2050. These are not the only potential firm generation technology that could meet the role. For example, other clean, firm, dispatchable, non-combustion resources, such as long-duration storage or advanced nuclear reactors, could play a similar role in the future. However, these studies, the studies in the literature review, tended to only include technologies that are commercially viable today, and hence the reliance on combustion technologies to fill this firm generation role. Next slide, please. Great. A final important element of the region's grid is its transmission infrastructure, which is really the backbone of the grid. Expansion of interregional transmission will be crucial for 2 reasons. First, transmission expansion will reduce the amount of new electric generation needed in New England, which, as we've seen, is significant. And second, it will increase the transmission capacity between New England and other neighboring regions, which will allow the region to be more resilient as its reliance on variable resources like wind and solar increases over time. In general, the 5 studies took a pretty conservative approach, modeling a doubling of interregional transmission expansion between New England and Canada by 2050. And only one study, the Massachusetts CECP 2050 study, modeled needed interregional transmission expansion between the New England states, the Canadian provinces, and New York. That study found a quadrupling of transmission would be needed by 2050 to meet reliability for a high electrification grid. The Massachusetts 2050 Decarb Roadmap, which was a precursor to that 2050 CECP study, specifically analyzed a regional coordination scenario to examine the benefits of expanded build-out of both inter and intra-regional transmission in the region. It found that by 2050, relative to an all-option scenario, this regional coordination scenario modeled 2.4x more additions of interregional transmission and 2.5x more additions of intra-regional transmission. The study also found that this additional transmission reduced overall 2050 capacity needed in the region, generation capacity needed in the region, by over 10 gigawatts relative to the all-option scenario. And this was largely driven by decreases in solar, wind, and storage capacity. So next slide, please. Great. So our final takeaway is we have just 25 years left to deliver New England's grid of the future. As Jamie mentioned up top, this feels like we have plenty of time, and at the same time, it feels like this is tomorrow. So in summation, the region will have to significantly increase deployment of clean energy generation and transmission by orders of magnitude to keep pace with growing peak demand and annual load between now and 2050. The region has roughly 2 decades, given the long lead times in the project development lifecycle, to procure and build the clean energy infrastructure additions needed by 2050. This is a huge physical transition for the region's energy system, which must rapidly shift from fossil fuels to clean, reliable energy. In order to meet annual deployment needs, up to 5 gigawatts of new clean capacity must be sited, permitted, interconnected, and commissioned every year for the next 20 years under the modeled scenarios. I'm going to repeat that again just for emphasis. 5 gigawatts of new clean generation is needed annually in New England over the next 20 years. At the same time, the region must increase interregional transmission capacity by a factor of 4. So, as you can see, we certainly have our work cut out for us. However, we remain optimistic about the future of New England's grid and clean energy infrastructure. And in the words of Jalen Brown, we believe that the energy is truly about to shift. So now I'll pass the baton to my colleague, Nicole Pavia, who will wrap things up.
Thank you so much, Nelson, and thank you to our Acadia colleagues as well. So now that we've reviewed a lot of the findings from our analysis, we wanted to share some opportunities and options that emerged from our work that can help improve and build upon existing grid infrastructure in the region to help New England achieve its decarbonization goals and to support grid resilience and reliability and affordability. First, we know that it will be really important to deploy a diverse and wide range of resources. As both Nelson and Ben and Jamie actually said earlier, offshore wind and solar are expected to play really, really critical roles in New England's energy transition. And more clean and firm technologies can support those resources by providing dispatchable and more baseload power, which can also help reduce land use impacts of the energy transition. So all of these resources combined will create a portfolio of resources that can help the region achieve its goals. We also really want to recognize that New England has a lot of significant existing infrastructure already deployed, and a lot of this can be upgraded and improved to maximize its capacity and also its efficiency. This can also help reduce the need for brand new infrastructure that you might need new siting, permitting, and financing processes for. So this includes things like reconductoring and using other advanced transmission technologies like GETS, as mentioned here on the slide, as well as utilizing existing points of interconnection for offshore wind transmission. Another thing to mention is that it's really important to look beyond generating resources when we think about the energy transition. This is kind of a system of change that needs to occur. And so things like energy efficiency for homes and businesses, to reduce heating demands during peak times, for example, is going to be really important. Interregional transmission, sharing resources both with other ISOs and other states, between states, and also looking internationally to Canada are really promising venues for this. And also, of course, energy storage. So if we have a lot of renewables deployed and other variable resources, can we hang on to some of that energy and use it at more peak times? Another thing is that every state in New England has clean energy, climate goals, decarbonization goals. And it's really important to look beyond state to state policy and try to start to align policies more regionally. This can improve efficiencies. It can help states, borrow from other states when needed. It can also help reduce costs to ratepayers across the region when states are working together and planning more collaboratively. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And another thing that we are hearing more and more about all the time in the transmission space is interconnection queues. So we're seeing renewable and other clean capacity resources being stuck in interconnection queues, sometimes for years, and some resources end up dropping out of queues because they can't maintain the financing, or the project becomes less viable the longer the queues are. So this also, it ties into both building out transmission, but also looking at interconnection processes and reforming some of those processes. Next slide, please. So we know how much we need to build. We know that we don't have a lot of time to do it. And so how do we best ensure that we can get the resources that we need built? And this is where we can start looking beyond what we've discussed so far in this webinar to think about, okay, what are some of the enabling factors to get all of this stuff built so that the energy actually can shift. One thing we really find so important and want to highlight in this process is community involvement and engagement in the energy transition. Every piece of energy infrastructure is going to be sited, near people or in environments that people care about, that people derive economic benefits from. And so it's really, really important that communities are engaged early and often and meaningfully in this energy transition process. So that will be a really, really big focus area for our next webinar and is a big piece of our report as well. So I encourage you all to read a little bit more about what we've discussed in the report here. The report also includes 6 case studies across the region, each of them focusing on a different clean energy technology. And for this, we interviewed developers, we interviewed community members, other stakeholders who had a really big part to play in the story of these energy technologies. And we hope to learn from that both successes, what we can do similarly in future deployment efforts, but also maybe sometimes what didn't go so well and what we could improve going forward to make sure climate goals and decarbonization goals are reached. Um, and another really, really important piece of all of this is the regulatory aspect. So what are some of the policy, the siting and permitting regulations that can enable a faster transition? We look at that as well. Land use challenges, like I mentioned earlier, every piece of infrastructure is sited on land. Sometimes it's used for other things. So that's something that we've grappled with in writing this report, um, and community engagement challenges. So we look through all of those kind of options and we take a look at them more in depth, explain, how they factor into the whole deployment story. So we really encourage you to read the community engagement, the siting and permitting pieces of the report, and we'll be sure to cover that in much more detail in our next webinar, which we're really excited to put on for you all. And with that, I will pass it back to Jamie.
Awesome. Thanks, Nicole, and a great overview by all. So yeah, here's the big reveal on webinar 2. You can mark your calendars now, and the link for the registration will be forthcoming by email. But January 16th at noon Eastern, we'll be digging into part 2 of the report on just those siting, permitting, community engagement elements that Nicole just gave an overview of. So for now, I think we're going to take down the slides and turn it to Q&A. Thanks again for those who have already sent in some Q&A topics, and encourage everyone else to get your questions added to the Q&A function. The first question that came in pertained to electric vehicles. Obviously, they're a contributor to both peak and annual demand in the future, but the questioner notes or asks, where does the use of EVs for supply or demand flexibility fit into the studies of the literature review? So Ben, do you want to chime in on this briefly, and then I can add to it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we talked about the ability to for DR and load shifting kind of to reduce peak demand. But in terms of vehicle to grid, where vehicles are actually sending electricity back to the grid, that wasn't an area of focus in the studies. The studies tend to focus on modeling kind of commercialized technologies. So technologies that are commercially deployed today. It's kind of a conservative approach to modeling. And since we don't really have vehicle to grid deployment in New England at the moment, the studies didn't explicitly model that. The 3 studies that did look at DR and load flexibility, as I mentioned, they showed about 4.4 gigawatts of flexibility in 2050, and most of that was coming from EVs. So that's about a 7% reduction in peak demand. Water heating, especially electric heat pump water heating, is the other kind of prime target for flexible load that was really directly incorporated into a few of these studies. One interesting thing to note is that the Mass CECP study did provide pretty granular data, kind of hour by hour in 2050 and what was driving peak demand. And it was really interesting. That study assumed about 3/4 of EV shifting could be flexed out of kind of the peak hours in winter peaking in 2050. So EVs were only responsible for about 1.4 gigawatts of peak demand during the top 50 hours of peak in the winter of 2050, whereas space heating and water heating were responsible for about 24 gigawatts. So 1.4 gigawatts versus 24 gigawatts. It's just interesting to note that EVs in 2050 aren't really projected to be driving that winter peak demand. It's really a space heating driven peak demand. But if others want to kind of chime in on vehicle to grid, feel free.
Thanks, Ben. No, you covered it well. I mean, there's some vehicle to grid pilots that I'm aware of. There is increasingly functionality for vehicle to home or vehicle to load, but I think you gave a good overview of how the models approach studying this important but somewhat uncertain question. Keep in mind the models ballpark, 90% of light duty and like 50% of medium and heavy duty vehicles being electric by 2050. Currently today, there's about 12 million vehicles in New England, a mix of passenger and others. So it could be a very significant flexible resource for the region, especially if, as the CECP study assumed, that 3/4 of charging load could be flexed away from peak. So, yep, that could be a major contributor to how this all actually shakes out. Great, let's go to our second question. This questioner asks about sort of a topic of clean, firm technologies, and specifically asks about the potential for advanced nuclear. The questioner notes particularly given bipartisan support at the moment. So, CATF team, do you want to take a quick stab at this, and then maybe Ben or I could offer some other thoughts on clean, firm options?
Yeah, sure. I think from a technology perspective, this is something that we have a program at CATF dedicated to advanced nuclear, so we're interested in the potential of it. It seems like it could, for SMRs or something, for example, could be a much more modular technology that would have less land impact, could potentially be more specialized and deployed at areas of heavy industrial activity, for example, or in areas with really high load. So that is, I think, technology-wise, there's still some cost challenges, some policy challenges as well. But those, as the commenter mentions, there might be some more movement on these, just given the interest expressed at the federal level still, going into the next administration around nuclear, as well as momentum, I think, in the industry. So I would say overall, like from a technology perspective and policy perspective, there is movement, and that's something that we're tracking and we'll be able to provide more information on in the coming months and years. In terms of deployment in New England and potential for that, maybe I'll pass it to Jamie and Ben to if you have anything else to add there.
Sure. Thanks, Nicole. Great answer. Yeah, I mean, this gets to the point of like how long 25 years means in like research, development, and deployment cycles for emerging technologies. I think there is some potential prospect for advanced nuclear in the region, but it's still a race that is being run between multiple competing technologies. And it may not be one technology that wins out. It might be a portfolio of these resources. Another questioner asked about long duration energy storage. We have seen a new major grant given by the Department of Energy to support I think New England's first large-scale multi-day iron air battery storage technology deployment in Maine from Form Energy. We're really excited about that potential, both to reduce curtailment and help with some of the north-south constraints that exist on the grid. So that too may be part of this race. and even beyond. I mean, I've seen research coming out of the West about the potential learning curve updates on enhanced geothermal. So even in regions like New York and New England with maybe less shallow thermal reserves, who knows what options might be unlocked by 2050. So great question, and keep them coming. Another question was asked about solar, and the questioner asks sort of why we can't require solar on every big box store, parking lot, brownfield to make it easy on homes, where it supports local installers, et cetera. This is a great question, and it was a sort of the subject of direct analysis by Massachusetts over the last 1 to 2 years. The Department of Energy Resources commissioned Synapse Energy Economics to do a study of solar feasibility across the entire Commonwealth, sort of a technical potential study for solar. It didn't look it looked not only at sort of the raw square footages of parking lots and rooftops and brownfields and things like you note, but it also took into account like suitability for shading and slope and alignment with southern solar radiation exposure. So the results of that were pretty significant. You could actually meet all of Massachusetts, I think, annual energy needs if you were to put solar on those locations. What it comes down to in the context of the studies that we're showing is what are the most sort of cost-effective and feasible pathways for the region as a whole. So I will say the models tend to prefer utility scale solar because it's shown in sort of a cheaper, more cost-effective entry in the proverbial spreadsheet. So I do think there is a potential for localities to really turn the dials to express preferences toward rooftop, brownfield, parking canopy siting options, if that's a preference that that locality has. And that might make the shift of solar tilt a little bit away from utility scale and more toward distributed scale over the long term. So definitely going to be one of these questions that we'll be watching unfold over the coming years. Let me look at our other questions here. Let's see. One questioner asks about timeframes. I think Nelson, or maybe Nicole, you mentioned just like the sheer timeline that it takes from originating a project through to commissioning. This questioner asks about the average time frame for permitting new or upgraded transmission lines. I certainly have some regional data points, but Nelson and Nicole, I know you guys have been thinking about this from a national perspective. So how should we be thinking about the number of cycles that we have between now and 2050?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in on that. And I think from our research perspective, Jamie, I would love to hear about your anecdotal data because we've looked at a lot of lines that require federal permits or that are basically go through the NEPA process. Of course, not all transmission lines need to go through a NEPA process or have federal involvement. I think those projects their timelines tend to extend sometimes pretty significantly up until like the decade-long time frame. And I should say, even in New York, we're seeing transmission lines within the state that are taking a really long time as well. So, but I think there are other smaller scale transmission lines that can be provided either by the utility or um, by merchant transmission developers that are smaller scale if they don't cut through federal lands or require federal permitting. Those timeframes can be faster, though sometimes it is those interregional or interstate lines that are really what's needed to alleviate costs and connect load centers to places where clean energy is most effectively and cheaply generated. So yeah, I think the upper limits we're seeing are like 10 to 15 years um, for more complex projects, but I think that just goes to show one, the importance of upgrading the systems that we currently have available. There are a lot of, like I mentioned, a lot of technologies out there that can help improve the efficiency of existing transmission lines. And those can be installed relatively quickly and at relatively much less cost. So I know that those are emerging points of discussion in the transmission space, and our utilities are very aware of them for their cost saving potential. And so hopefully we can see those. And I think also just if those interstate lines are needed, I think it just speaks to the importance of um, collaboration between states on siting and permitting regulations, and making sure that there's coordination between the key stakeholders in those states. Those are some of the biggest challenges that we see in building transmission, is lack of coordination and lack of regulatory alignment between jurisdictions. So hopefully if those things are done, we can see those timelines speed up a little bit.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and just as one anecdote, the New England Clean Energy Connect line that's being constructed between Quebec and Massachusetts, or might end in Maine, but into New England. The legislation that enabled that procurement was in 2016. I think the procurement took place in 2017, 2018. It's been several years since then of construction and permitting and legal challenges. And I think that we just learned that project is expected to start energizing late next year, if I have that right. So, it's in the same ballpark that you discussed, Nicole, in terms of pushing the limits of a decade. So let's look at another question. I think I'm going to pair two together, one relating to costs and one related to sort of like markets and like how do we actually, actualize this transition from an electricity wholesale market standpoint. One questioner asks about the RGGI program, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and how this electric demand outlook may affect that program and the market for emissions allowances there. Another questioner asked about costs writ large for this, noting that there are some reports due by end of year in Massachusetts estimating the cost to implement the CECP. So they asked, did our review consider costs? So to that latter question, no, the review that we undertook did not get into costs. It wasn't an aspect of our report. But a lot of obviously the clean energy technology deployment options that we outline are generally, offer strong prospects for affordability in the region, above and beyond, or rather below the approaches that would include expanding and retaining reliance on some of the pretty significant fossil fuel infrastructure that the region currently relies on. I'll note briefly, as an aside, Acadia Center offered a rebuttal to a recent report that tried to raise some alarms about the potential costs, but we actually think there's a pretty realistic but optimistic picture to be painted there, and maybe that can be the subject of a future webinar. But with respect to RGGI, and I'll welcome others to chime in here, but the third program review is underway right now. I do think the states and RGGI Inc. are endeavoring to look at some of the medium to long-term forecasts like this as they adjust the cap for the program. At Acadia Center, we've certainly been pushing for a strong cap as much as possible, recognizing that there, as always, are some differences in ambition between and among the different RGGI states. But I do think that this long-term trajectory should directly be taken into account as that market gets calibrated in this program review and down the line. And there was a question somewhat relatedly around sort of the ambition of 2050 net zero targets. Should we be updating them? Does what we found in this research suggest not resetting 2050 goals? Where do you think the sort of the state of the science and analysis nets out right now?
Yeah, we're definitely not suggesting that resetting net zero by 2050 goals should be off the table to like a more accelerated date, 2045, for example, or 2040. I think we were just presenting the results of the deep decarbonization pathways studies. And I noted there's differences in kind of the assumptions and the overall GHG reduction target in those studies. There's kind of a range of 80 to 90% reduction in gross emissions. The Princeton Net Zero America study was the only study that explicitly modeled actually achieving net zero. Some of the other studies, they get to like, for example, a 90% gross emissions reduction, and then assume that there will be carbon sequestration to kind of offset the remaining 10% of emissions, but don't get into the specifics of how to achieve that remaining 10%. And I think, an area that's been a focus for Acadia Center is helping states like kind of think through how they're defining net zero, what the implications are for that. Are they trying to achieve net zero through in-state means only, through carbon trading schemes, et cetera? The goal and the definition varies a lot across state to state. States like Maine, who have, a large carbon sequestration sink in the forests of Maine, face a very different situation than states like Rhode Island. So I think, we're actively working with states to help kind of think through how they're thinking about net zero, and would encourage any state that, is considering a net zero target at a more accelerated pace than 2050 to adopt that into law for sure.
Great, thank you, Ben. And yeah, I'll also note, having spent some time in the New York world myself, that New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act does have an electric sector zero emissions requirement, 100% zero emissions requirement by 2040. So there are also sort of sector-specific policies that could be examined in addition to sort of the economy-wide net zero question as well. Nicole, Nelson, anything to add on that? We can go to another question if not. Let me see what else we have. I think we've gotten through many of our questions here. Talked about cost. We got some technical questions on the lit review. We can batch a couple of these. One questioner asked about, in terms of efficiency improvements, were smart meters and other grid modernization technologies part of this study? And somewhat relatedly, with respect to least cost optimization, do we know what degree the studies looked at avoided distribution costs of broadly distributed energy resources in that category?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, these studies are at a pretty high level, like thinking through economy-wide decarbonization. But I think a lot of the flexibility and demand response kind of integrated into the modeling essentially assumes kind of widespread deployment of AMI, whether it be related to, electric heating specific rates, or, EV flexibility to reduce peak demand in the winter in 2050. That's all going to require AMI deployment to be effective. So, we're definitely in favor of, widespread AMI deployment as long as it's, tied to targets, but actually utilizing that AMI equipment in a productive way that reduces peak demand and delivers value to ratepayers. And then, sorry, so remind me of the second question, Jamie.
Yeah, it was related to just like broadly distributed energy resources. I do know the studies looked at distributed solar as a share of overall solar, or some of them did. But and I guess a portion of battery storage might be behind the meter battery storage. But do you have the sense that the studies really have fulsome examination of distributed energy resources, or is that sort of an area for more granular drilling down in future studies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, definitely a few of the studies did kind of explicitly kind of express their assumptions around DER and the potential for cost reduction on that front. I think, again, since these studies are very high level, they don't always provide the most granular detail and assumptions in every kind of specific area of the analysis. So yeah, I think there is definitely opportunity for more kind of like granular exploration of the potential of DERs in terms of cost reduction and saving.
Great. Just to zoom in on, or maybe even circle back to the discussion on sort of distributed solar options versus utility scale solar options. If folks have our report up, you can turn to page 28. Figure 12 in the report breaks down the at least 3 of the studies we looked at have a breakout of how much utility scale solar versus how much rooftop or distributed solar. As I said, the 3-study average for those studies does tilt more toward the utility scale, reflecting the sort of cost effective, which I will put in air quotes, agreeing with some of the comments we had, pricing and cost figures for that category of resources. But I will say, maybe as a preview to next month's webinar, that really is the rubber is going to hit the road when it comes to the local community engagement and siting processes around solar. New England, I mean, has some land availability, but much less land availability for utility scale solar than many other regions in the US. We've seen utility scale solar take off in Texas and California, for example, but opportunities for that type of construction in New England are fairly limited. And I think we're already seeing, some tensions around land use and siting impacts arise in parts of the region, although there are other promising bright spots of that. I just saw Brown University cut the ribbon on a new 40 megawatt solar project in North Kingstown, Rhode Island. One of the biggest solar projects that I'm aware of in the whole region that was on a former gravel pit site in Rhode Island. So I think as a preview, the models say one thing, but I think in reality, time may reveal a different pattern with respect to the breakout of distributed versus utility scale solar in the region. Okay, let me look back at our questions. I think we're coming to the end of our time. I think with that, we can go ahead and wrap up. Really a big thanks and a virtual round of applause to my co-presenters and to all of you for tuning in for so long. Thanks for spending, again, either your lunch break or maybe your breakfast with us, depending on where you are in the country. Definitely join us again soon next month on January 16th at 12 Eastern. The link for the Zoom registration will be coming by email shortly after today's webinar. So have I missed anything, guys? Is that it? Okay, yep, as the chat says, if you do have additional questions or if you want to reach out to us, feel free to send any of us an email. We'll be glad to connect. And I think there was at least one request for giving this presentation at a different forum. So we'll be glad to follow up on that and talk with folks in more detail. So until next time, enjoy the rest of your Thursday and we'll talk again soon.